Hello and welcome.
Welcome. I'm Angie Thurston.
I'm Casper ter Kuile, and we're so glad you're here. We're glad our friends at Glean are filming this conversation. What we hope to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to share a little bit of our work over the last 3 or 4 years, and then have some conversation with you all. So to start, we want to share a little bit about who we are.
Who are you, Casper?
So my name's Casper ter Kuile. My parents are both Dutch, but I was born and raised in England. We have Liz here from England as well. And I grew up in a really very non-religious home. You may know that Holland, I think next to Denmark, are perhaps the most secular countries on the planet. And I was raised in a very Dutch family. We celebrated Dutch festivals and spoke Dutch at home. But I went to a Waldorf school, a Steiner school. Has anyone come across Waldorf schools? Yes. So you will know that there's a very rich kind of liturgical calendar, a lot of nature-based festivals and a very strong community often around these schools. And that was definitely true for me. We would make little lanterns and walk down to the Cattle to sing on Christmas Eve. We would dress up all in white for Whitsun, which I later learned was also called Pentecost. There were all of these amazing, we danced around the maypole, with all of these amazing experiences. But there was never any sort of theological frame put on the experience. The experience was very much just left as a mystery for the child. And I think in some ways that's really shaped how I've thought about my work now being within a divinity school. So I ended up choosing to leave this magical place and go to a very kind of posh English prep school where we had pink blazers and sports day and all of the rest of it. And I came out in high school, so you can imagine that moving from this safe, wonderful, kind of warm, nature-based, familial Steiner school to this very kind of cold-hearted, academic, stressful boarding school was one of moving from community to isolation. And I think that's one of the reasons I've ended up being so passionate about community, is because having felt what it is and then felt its absence certainly leaves a mark. So I ended up taking all my kind of teenage angst out at the man by becoming a climate activist and getting very involved in mobilizing young people around the UN climate negotiations. But felt like I was missing tools in the toolbox. You know, I'd learned about policy and I'd learned about campaigning. But when I look back in history, the things that really seemed to shift culture was communities transforming rather than me emailing individual people saying, you know, will you give me $25? So I ended up looking to religion really as a strategy for social change. I came to the divinity school kind of by accident, but really interested in what someone who called themselves an atheist like me might learn from religion to apply to social change. And then in our first seminar, I met Angie here for our Introduction to Ministry Studies seminar, which some of you will know. We start by sharing our spiritual autobiographies. And we realized we were both asking the same question: how do people like us, who kind of sit outside of a religious identity in the boxes way that we're trained to think about religion, where do we find meaning and where do we find belonging? And that led us on this How We Gather quest. More on that in a moment. But how about you, Angie? What brought you to this?
Thank you, Casper. So, like Casper, I grew up with a very unusual spiritual upbringing, at least as compares to what one might expect for someone who ended up in divinity school. So I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and I was the child of 2 spiritual seekers, but I was not raised within any religious tradition or institution. My mother grew up Jewish and my father grew up Christian, but my mom grew up more politically Jewish and my dad grew up more socially Christian, and both of them were prototypical spiritual seekers who found themselves in San Francisco in the 1970s and met each other and ultimately conceived me. But the 2 of them found some common ground with a text called the Urantia Book that most people have not heard of. Has anyone heard of the Urantia Book?
Whoa.
Wow, okay. For those watching on camera, there are 4 people in this audience who have heard of the Urantia Book, which may be a record. So this book ended up being sort of a central spiritual reference point for my home life. But as far as readership, there's just a diaspora all over the world, and there's no organizing traditional liturgy or ritual or anything of that nature. So I really grew up with kind of a free-range spiritual home life where my siblings and I were the co-creators of ritual. and of holidays. And we had Sunday family meetings where we would choose a quote and we would get to go around and say what we were grateful for. We got to choose the songs we sang. We would combine it with what we were learning in school and how we understood the universe. So it was very fulsome and rich, but it was also basically just our family unit. We moved from San Francisco to Boulder when I was 8 and spent those 10 years before I left for college in Boulder, Colorado, really having a very creative and rich, but also isolated spiritual life. And so I ended up following, I followed that creativity strand and studied playwriting in college, came to the East Coast, did that undergrad, and moved to Brooklyn when I was in my early 20s to be a playwright and write musicals and work in the arts, and ended up doing a lot of creative collaborative work, which I was finding fulfilling, but increasingly incomplete. And the conundrum I kept feeling inside of myself was that when we would come together, we would create something bigger than ourselves, whether it was a musical or a festival or a piece of dance, and we would form deep community around that experience, but then the community would dissipate once the experience ended, and that always felt unsatisfying, so it was ephemeral. And then also there were all these conversations I was wanting to have about what that feeling was, which felt profound, or maybe even transcendent, about the co-creation we were doing, and that conversation was not on the table. And so I started to wonder if I was alone in that feeling, basically. And it was around 2009 that I encountered the phrase spiritual but not religious on Match.com. And everyone I was matched with had it, and I was like, what is that and where are they? And so it was that combined with this kind of ennui that started me down a path of basically where are people like us finding meaningful experiences of belonging. And because I was outside of a traditional religious context, it didn't even occur to me to look within religion. I was looking where my friends were going, which was places like Brooklyn Boulders and to yoga studios and to these maker spaces and arts communities. And so I had this little spreadsheet called SBNR Resources, which stood for Spiritual But Not Religious, and I just started populating it in my bedroom in Brooklyn and became fascinated by the discovery that I was an unaffiliated millennial, and that lo and behold, I was not alone in that. And in fact, it was a third of our generation, which we'll get to in a minute. And so it was that fascination with this transforming religious and community landscape that ultimately brought me to Harvard Divinity School and to the fateful classroom where I met Casper. So let's just take another minute to look at what is going on. And I think for those of you watching, this is probably a familiar story, but just to encapsulate it for a minute. So basically, Americans with no religious affiliation. This is a line that is going up and up and up, and the younger you are in America, the more likely it is to be you. So if you can see this slide here, the youngest Americans are that top line, and then there's a dot in the very top corner, and that's the younger millennials, right? So Casper and I are both elders of the millennial generation, but for those millennials younger than us, the disaffiliation trend is even more steep.
And the same is true with Gen Z. I should say the moment Angie shared her spreadsheet was the real moment of millennial intimacy.
That's right.
That's when you know you really trust one another, with the Google Docs. So, yeah, exactly. So all of this shifting sand within the kind of religious identity narrative has meant significant changes for religious institutions. We're familiar with this fact that this is a conservative estimate that 3,500 churches close down every year. Within the Christian realm, within the Jewish realm, a big question has been about intermarriage, with 70% of non-Orthodox Jews now marrying across religious lines. Of course, many seminaries are shrinking or closing down. Here at Harvard Divinity School, we're lucky to be bucking that trend, but it's certainly true across the country. And all of this feels part of a broader kind of narrative of distrust, whether it's in government or the media. The large internet companies now fall within that too. So that there's this kind of disconnection with people's individual experience and the institutions that were housing them, which has led to a cultural crisis, really.
Yeah, and so we use this phrase spiritual homelessness, right? That there can be an assumption that the trend of disaffiliation from organized religion means that people are becoming secular. And it certainly is the case that there are plenty who self-identify as atheist and agnostic from within the unaffiliated group, but many of those folks have something else going on. And so you have 2 in 3 believing in God, 1 in 5 praying every day, but in some sense they're cobbling together a spiritual life and don't have a home for it, right? So that also leads to and is part of this broader trend of isolation in this country, right? So you have 1 in 4 people who have no one to talk to about what matters most to them, and 1 in 5 who have just one confidant. So that sense of poverty in terms of relationship.
And that includes people's family members.
Yeah.
And this has massively shrunk. In the 1980s, it looked like something 3 or 4, and now it's down to 1. So there really is a shift in the relational fabric around us. And of course, we see that in our political system as well.
Right, polarization.
Right.
And the implications of that, I mean, on a personal level are profound, but also in terms of just mass public health statistics like mortality. You have now studies coming out that are showing that loneliness is a greater indicator of mortality than obesity or smoking, right? So there's a crisis in terms of whether it's depression and anxiety and suicide or just people's lifespans, their disconnection from each other being something that's obviously contributory to the crisis.
And that plays out in ways that I had never thought about. For example, if you're feeling a little sick, as I am today, usually it takes about 4 people on average to tell you that you should go to a doctor before you go to a doctor. So if you don't have people in your life telling you, hey, you should get that thing checked out, you're actually less likely to go, or it takes longer before you go. So things like, breast cancer screenings or discovery of other rare kind of diseases that might come across your path, it takes longer to discover those when you're socially isolated. So that's a story that's a story you may be familiar with, but that's not the story we're here to tell you. We want to focus on what we started to see when we asked our friends, so where do you go to find belonging? Like where's your community? Who are your people? And a surprising number of people told us CrossFit. CrossFit has become one of our favorite case studies for a number of reasons. First of all, the kind of evangelical zeal is unmistakable. Do we have any CrossFitters in the room? Speak now.
And they would.
and they would. There's a favorite joke of mine, which is, how do you know if someone is vegan, goes to Harvard, or does CrossFit? They tell you, which I found to be true. And so this kind of culture of mission within the CrossFit world is very, very strong. Not because people just love it and, they want to invite you to come along to the party, but often it's a sense of like, this has changed my life and I want to change your life with CrossFit.
Right.
In fact, that's what they look for when people want to open a CrossFit box. They don't have to kind of go through, strenuous pastoral care training or business school. It's a 2-day seminar and an essay whereby you have to demonstrate that you want to change people's lives with CrossFit. That's the kind of key indicator that they look for a successful CrossFit owner. There's a really interesting kind of culture which is very connected to kind of the military and veterans, whereby a lot of the workouts every day, the whole CrossFit box does the same workout a number of times a day. It's called the workout of the day, or the WOD. And this WOD is also shared across all the 15,000 CrossFit boxes around the world. So just like in a Christian church, you might say the Lord's Prayer, as does everyone else around the world. Here, everyone does the same combination of burpees and a 500-meter sprint and various barbell exercises. And so there's a sort of embodiment, an embodied connection where you're doing the same movements as everyone else. And these workouts of the day are given names. And on specific days, they're named after fallen heroes, people who have died in the line of battle, often police force members. So I remember the first time I went to a box for the name of research and my expanding waistline.
They call the gyms boxes.
Yes, the gym is called a box. Thank you, Ange. And this particular workout was called The Murph, named after Sergeant Murphy, who was a war hero. So there's this very interesting way of kind of honoring the dead that happens within these communities. We hosted an event here, nearly 3 years ago, with one of the co-founders of CrossFit, Coach Greg Glassman. And Coach Greg is quite a character. and we had a conversation under the title CrossFit as Church, ? First of all, the Sperry room had never looked so muscular. For those of you who were there, you will remember the brawn in the room. They had really come to see the guru, like they had come to see the high priest. It meant so much to them to see him here. But Greg used this language of, I'm not trying to build a skyscraper, I'm trying to shepherd a flock. I'm trying to tend an orchard. It was this very kind of pastoral language, because what happens in these boxes is that it becomes the center of people's community. If you're showing up 3, 4, 5, 6 times a week in the same location with the same people, obviously these are going to be the friends and comrades that you share your life with. So if someone needs a ride to the hospital, or they're going away for a weekend and need someone to look after their dog, or someone is diagnosed with cancer, these are going to be the people that kind of rally around you, host a fundraiser, do whatever it takes to help you through. And the kind of gym owners often set the tone for that, but there's a mutual kind of loving support that starts to happen between the people who work out together, to the point that if you don't show up on a Thursday, and usually you show up every Thursday, they will call you and say, "Where are you?" Now, when was the last time you saw that happen in a congregation? Probably a little while ago. For good reason, right? Like, it feels very intense. But there's a very strong culture of accountability in these fitness groups, and especially with CrossFit. There's often a whiteboard where you write your goal for the month down and you kind of track your progress. The most humiliating moment of my life in the last few years was when you do the workout together and a specific amount of time, and you have to try and finish it within that amount of time. And I was the last one to finish. But instead of leaving me in my shame, everyone stands around you and is like, "You can do it, Casper!" As you're like trying to be like, "Oh God."
At like 5 in the morning.
Yeah, it's like no one wants to be seen at that moment, but they're like in your face, which means that like actually you do more than you think you're capable of. So that's the reason why the accountability matters, because it's actually a sign that the other people around you know that you're capable of more, and that you then start to believe that you're able to as well.
Yeah, I would say that phenomenon with CrossFit of being seen in your most vulnerable is one of the key ingredients that makes it transformative and differentiates it from like a gym or something of that nature. And I can say, as someone who was definitely on the skeptical side when we first encountered CrossFit, in part because of just the cult-like vibe that it has, I have been amazed to discover, especially on this last notion of caring for the sick. I think something that comes from being with each other in this kind of raw and in many cases very uncomfortable place is something that then leads people to feel ready to show up for each other when they're in that place. And so you do see people in CrossFit context constantly showing up for each other when they're at their most vulnerable, especially if they're ill or a family member is going through something. And part of what that's led to is that there's an entire nonprofit landscape of CrossFit boxes, especially working with things like substance addiction and recovery, where you have people basically saying, "My disease wants me isolated. The antidote to this addiction is community," and to being seen and taken through that process in loving accountability, basically. So there's a remarkable kind of emergent landscape of combining CrossFit with things like recovery that's happening all over the world.
They like to say community is built on suffering and laughter, which I think is quite good.
Yeah.
So CrossFit is one of these examples, but there are others.
Yes, and we're just going to take you through a few of them, because we want to kind of show you that as Casper and I started doing this work, as you'll see these communities, they seem like they're in very different sectors, right? The CrossFit is a fitness community, and we're about to share the Dinner Party, which is a community that formed around experiences of grief and loss, and others to come will be in things like the arts. And so you'd think these would have nothing to do with each other, but we're trying to pull out some of the shared DNA that we started to see and to hear people speak to. So with the Dinner Party, this is a community that was founded by a group of friends, all of whom had lost a loved one, someone close to them, like a parent or a partner or a sibling. And they were in their late 20s, early 30s, and at a time when, in their own words, bringing up death was a conversation killer, right? And especially, say it had been a year since your mother passed and you didn't, it was a time when people in their social circles, both their close circles and the people they would encounter in their everyday lives, no longer were in a place of that being on the table. And obviously, it was still on the table very much every day for these folks. And so Lennon Flowers, one of the founders, and a couple of her friends decided, you know what, we're gonna just have dinner, and this conversation is gonna be on the table. We'll get together, we'll have wine, we'll have food, we'll bring a potluck. And so, lo and behold, that dinner probably started at 6 and went till like 12 or 1 in the morning, and they were like, we wanna do this again. And lo and behold, they started telling people about it, and they were like, I want that too, I want that too. So the dinner party has now become global. There are dinner tables all over the world. And as we think about, well, what are some of the DNA that are built into that, primary in that is this notion of spiritual accompaniment, right? People showing up and bringing their whole selves, bringing parts of their lives that otherwise in our kind of dominant context are not part of what you get to talk about, right? And consciously inviting that and accompanying each other as they have those conversations. And as you might guess, while it may start with a conversation about loss and about grief and about the various other emotions and experiences related to that, then you start to form relationships as tables meet week after week, month after month, and there's a process of healing that happens in part because people start bringing the rest of their lives. They start becoming friends. They start talking about other relationships and the laughter in their lives. So this healing process occurs over time that's extremely powerful for the folks involved. And those of you who have been involved in religious communities that rely on small groups in some way will know the power of that spiritual technology to elicit that kind of intimacy, right? And that kind of loving holding of each other throughout a life experience, and especially in a journey like healing. And lastly, we just thought it was noteworthy that here you have a group of people gathering over bread and wine in remembrance of those in their lives, right? So in a Christian context, you think about the Eucharist, but even beyond that, of course, whether it's Shabbat or any other gathering over a meal that occurs in order to ground us in our own experience as it relates to lineage, ancestry, and history. That's something that the dinner party walked right into.
And it's noteworthy, I think, that these are hosted in people's homes. There's something very intimate and personal and welcoming always to the dinners. And there's a virtue of beauty, I think, in how the table is presented, how people are welcomed. That is so important. So, often they're put in the category of kind of like grief groups, which might mean, with a styrofoam cup of coffee in a basement somewhere. That's very much not the tone that the dinner party looks for. Another question that often is kind of, asked of groups like this, even of the fitness groups that we've talked about, is that isn't this something very individualistic, right? It's really about you and your consumption of a community. What's been interesting to see, especially with the dinner party, is that as communities have formed, there's something that happens, some sort of alchemic reaction to that connection, which draws people out into the world. So one of the really awesome things is to have seen how the dinner party has networked with other groups to start to host dinners around electoral questions, around bridging the social political divides, to try and bring people together to have a conversation about each other's stories and experience before we get to the politics and the policy. And so they formed this coalition called the People's Supper alongside Faith Matters and Hollaback and a few other partners now. So it's really interesting to see that even if things do start as a response to an individual's need, right? These were 3 friends who got together and said, I can't talk about the death of my mother anywhere honestly. I want that. I'm going to create this. Something happens which kind of pulls them out into the world. Something a little closer to home, over here in Somerville, just a few hundred yards away from us, is Artisans Asylum. This is one of the, I think more than 1,000 makerspaces now across the country. Who's ever been to a makerspace? Okay, 1 or 2 of you, wonderful.
Nice.
It is worth going if you've never been. They love to have visitors. It is literally right around the corner. And as you walk in, it looks a little bit kind of like some sort of factory or
yeah, there's just like stray robots in the corner and like things hanging from the ceiling and lots of colors. Yeah.
Lots of colors. It's in this old warehouse. And essentially what it is, it's lots of spaces for individual artists, artisans, technologists, inventors to create what they want to create in their lives. So often it brings together people who otherwise would never meet, right? Someone who perhaps has struggled with work and just lost their job, with an MIT professor who uses this space as a place to invent the fun things in their life that they can't do in their job. And so this incredible culture of creative formation has taken place, where people feel invested in one another's capacity and development to create wonderful, new, exciting things, whether it's jewelry or whether it's an amazing Halloween costume for their kid, or whether it's the next, laser beam creation machine.
There's an entire army of mutant bicycles that comes out at night here. Some of you may have seen them in Boston and Somerville. That they're housed there. And they call it a fleet. So their fleet is housed at Artisans Asylum, and the riders come and they go out at night and spread joy, and then come back.
For example, one night I went with him and we delivered presents to unexpected people around Christmas time. It was very fun. What's been interesting to see is that, in part because of who this community attracts, the physical building and the community has become really a sanctuary. There's a reason why it's called Artisans Asylum. It's open 24 hours a day, and so often people who might struggle, with self-harm or suicidal thoughts will...
There's a lot of housing insecurity too.
A lot of housing insecurity. People will come to the sanctuary of Artisans Asylum and work on a welding project, or connect with someone else who is there at kind of 4 a.m. To feel like they're not alone in the pain and suffering that they're experiencing. And so the community leaders have, again, taken on a very pastoral role to support people through mental health crises or experiences of housing insecurity, which again has led the community to become an advocate for better public housing in the city of Somerville. So again, that really interesting shift from the individual to the community to a broader sense of social justice has emerged here. And the lovely thing is that, as this became the center of people's lives, they wanted to celebrate together. So at Thanksgiving, they host a large Maker's Giving, where there's these reams of tables with delicious food, wonderful conversation, but also all of the wacky and wonderful creations that people have made that stand kind of pride of place on the tables.
So you make your green beans and you also make a 3D printed vase to go next to it, right? It's that kind of vibe, yeah. And there's, I think, the last thing that I just find really fascinating and exciting. If you think about like old religious guilds, like creative guilds, or even monastic communities, right, where there's a sense of monks having their spiritual life together, but also like making things, that is so present here. Just this sense of mutual improvement that is oriented around your artistic expression, your creative expression, as well as your whole personhood. And a real spirit of generosity. Like, we all know how awful online forums are, and Artisans Asylum has an online forum for its members where they, just astonishing levels of like, oh, I'm wondering how to make this thing, and I think I need this kind of plywood, and like 3 hours later that plywood is on somebody's porch. Like, literally this happened. It's that kind of outpouring of mutual support and investment in each other's process and progress.
Do we have any Methodists in the room? Excellent. This feels somehow kind of early Wesleyan to me. Right. So one of the shortcomings in our research when we started, we really did start asking our friends, in our own social location, where do you find community? Where do you find meaning? And so overwhelmingly, the early case studies that we looked at were wealthier, whiter, more coastal, more urban than the average American. So one of the communities we got to discover later was an amazing community called Afroflow Yoga. Now, what I especially love about this community, it's a sort of 2-hour experience of dance, drumming, storytelling, and community building. Leslie Salmon-Jones and Jeff Jones, who founded it, really took their own travels to recreate the Middle Passage, the journey of people who'd been enslaved from Africa to what is now the United States, and wanted to offer a place of healing and connection for people to kind of live out and work through that journey in their own ancestral lives. And so it's an amazing kind of non-judgmental space. If you participate, and there's wonderful classes here in Cambridge that I recommend you go to, you'll see that it starts with kind of like what you'd expect, like in a yoga class. It starts with everyone's doing their individual movements, but then it becomes more like you would see in a dance class where everyone is starting to move together. And then there's these moments where you as an individual are invited to kind of dance through an alley that's created of participants. And so it's this very invitational, liberating experience where whatever you have to give is welcome. So this experience of non-judgment, this experience of authenticity, and
you're really seen.
And again,
uncomfortable again, but also, yeah.
This time they're not in your face cheering at you, which I have to say did feel better. But so this sense of healing through embodiment is something that is very, very present, both at Afroflow Yoga, but also in more and more experiences that we're seeing out there. I don't know whether it has something to do with the kind of cynicism of our culture or the hyper-rationality of how we think about spirituality these days, but more and more efforts seem to be using the body as the main entryway into spiritual life. So whether that's the kind of re-emergence of the mikveh, for example, in the Jewish context, whether it's about being outside, gardening, ecology, or whether it's through things like dance and embodied practice.
Yeah, and something we'll touch on a bit more is the question of how the leaders of these various communities are being prepared and trained, and how, especially in these more innovative efforts, often those who end up in leadership created something that they wanted in their own lives and may not necessarily be prepared for the fact that people are bringing their whole lives then into this community. I think Afroflow Yoga is a great example of really just strong leadership from the founders and a strong expectation from the founders that those who are going to carry forward this work be really prepared themselves. So for instance, you have a lot of folks who say, oh, Afroflow Yoga, like I'm a yoga teacher, I would love to incorporate more of like the moves you do, basically, right? And Leslie and Jeff have been very strong on the fact that to go through their teacher training, you must, as a leader, also go through your own healing journey before you become someone who is equipped to guide others on such a journey. And so that involves ancestral healing, and it's, they're very welcoming to anyone who wants to come and go through that training. You're welcome in, but you have to go all the way through before you can actually be kind of invited to then pass it on. And I think that's been a really key distinction. And as we've gotten to know a landscape of emerging communities, Casper and I have been doing this work for about 5 years now. Plenty of them are gone already. And some of that has to do with the fact that leadership has not been equipped to deal with the reality of being in community.
And that can include everything from a community where someone has experienced sexual assault and brings that to the community. The community does not know how to handle that and kind of collapses. A community where the founder was diagnosed with brain cancer and died, and everything was so built around his kind of charisma and vision and incredible skills that once he was gone, the community kind of dissipated. And even in that example, the community wanted to honor him, of course, and have some sort of memorial, and they ended up looking to an ordained rabbi to help them with that, because no one in the community really had done this before. So over and over again, we've seen, although so many of the kind of new communities that have excited us are stepping outside of the traditional structures of religion and often not even claiming religious or spiritual language, there are so many things that they need that religious institutions have been thinking about for generations. So there's this kind of fascinating connection between the two, which we've tried to do a little bit in our work. The final case study we'll share is SoulCycle. Who has ever taken a SoulCycle class? Okay, this is your homework. I highly encourage you to go. SoulCycle's become, again, one of our favorite case studies because it's so obvious it's called Soul Cycle. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that something is going on here. So when we started our research for How We Gather, we were just two HDS students like calling up random people saying, hello, can we interview you? And the head of PR at SoulCycle at the time, you could feel her taking the phone and going, Divinity School? What? Hello? And they were very, very resistant. They were worried that we might portray them in a kind of culty or religious way when it was very important to them to kind of stay. We were literally told, soul is just a brand concept.
We said, what do you mean by soul? And she said, am I on the record? I think some change has actually occurred even since that time.
Absolutely, and that, I mean, remarkable. You now see the CEO of SoulCycle claiming the spirituality of what happens on the bike. And so you really see how quickly our culture has shifted about our comfort, or at least the kind of mainstream culture's comfort with something like soul or spirit. So the first thing to say is this is not just a bike class. If you've taken a spin class, you'll be familiar with the kind of, sitting on the bike and turning up, to number 5 for the hill climb or whatever it is. This really is a liturgical experience. The 45-minute class is mapped out in 5 segments, and you walk in and the whole room is completely dark. There are candles or votives on a raised platform or altar, you could say, and everyone is sitting in bikes as you are in an audience, in rows, and the music is overwhelmingly loud. So again, this embodied experience, it's breaking down our defenses of resistance, and we're kind of just overwhelmed by the stimulation of the darkness, the noise, and our physical exertion to the point where we break through and feel what's really going on inside of us.
And by the way, the walls are plastered with words like warrior, rock star, maverick, renegade. Yeah.
And these are kind of supposed to be, I don't want to say they're like iconography, but they're 7 words that you can kind of, who am I today, right? Am I going to be a warrior? Am I going to be a renegade? Am I going to be a rock star? And what happens from the front of the room is not just pedal harder, pedal softer. This is full-on preaching. The lead rider will ask things like, who are you riding for today? And everyone's like, my kids, my husband, you're forced to kind of introspect as you're on the bike. And for those very special instructors who have received kind of A-grade status, they don't even sit on the bike anymore. We went to a class in LA where there was just some very cute guy on the bike instead of the instructor who just walked around and preached and said, there are angels waiting for you. They are clapping for you in heaven. She had gone to Oral Roberts University, a famous evangelical college. So
this is Oprah's SoulCycle instructor.
It, again, didn't take a genius to figure out that something is happening here. Now, importantly, the language which they use is always invitational, and it's always open to your understanding of what it means. So often questions are used. Obviously, no one is saying Jesus from the front of the room, right? Or any other kind of religious figure.
Right.
So we've had people tell us, SoulCycle is when I pray to Jesus, or SoulCycle is when I pay attention to my breath and my Buddha nature, or SoulCycle is just when I reflect on what's really important to me today. So there's this kind of, it offers a platform. It doesn't necessarily offer you exactly the content with which to make meaning.
Yeah, and that's definitely critical and part of the intensive training, to just return to that the instructors go through. That basically, so they don't, SoulCycle doesn't recruit based on fitness, although that's necessary. They recruit essentially based on performance and your capacity to inspire the people in the room. And they have an extensive, it's basically an audition process, and a lot of people who are in theater and dance and those kinds of fields end up being SoulCycle instructors because of their capacity to hold a room and to bring a room through an experience, which, as Casper said, has an arc that goes from that kind of welcome, and then you build, and then there's the hill climb. There's always a ballad, right, at the kind of climax of the class, where they turn out all the candles and the lights, so it's pitch dark in the room, and turn up some ballad, and you're invited to crank the resistance up as high as it goes, and you just pedal hard in the dark, and 45% of people cry. So you have to hold the room through that, and then through the kind of, they say out like a hero, right? That people leave feeling like they've just broken through.
And what's fascinating to see now is that people who've been soul cycling for nearly a decade at this point, they experience this breakthrough over and over again. And now the organization is looking at okay, so what can we give them that goes deeper? What will hold them after they've had the breakthrough? So we would not be surprised if we start to see things like SoulCycle dinners, for example. And again, they will host fundraisers. They have done all sorts of things which are kind of taking this next step. I'll say one thing, Julie Rice and Elizabeth Cutler, who were two of the co-founders, Julie always says that when it started with just an initial one single studio somewhere in Manhattan, that she would love people into staying, which I think is such a lovely phrase. And it really speaks to, we can look at some something like this, and particularly as faith leaders, I think you can see a number of problems with it sometimes. But there is an integrity in that desire of wanting to connect with people, wanting to give people a place of a spiritual home. One of my favorite things to think about also is how capitalism integrates with so many of these communities. SoulCycle is not cheap, right? It's often like $35 a class. And if that was not already enough, the booking system to get a specific bike opens, I think, at 12 p.m. on a Monday, so you can book the classes for that week. But if you pay for certain studios something like 10 grand, you get access on a Sunday to book those seats, because it is a covetous place to sit in the front row. So just like here in New England, we paid for pews, right, that you would have a little name of your family on the pew, the same thing is happening in SoulCycle. There's something very, very human going on. In terms of kind of that ability to be seen at the front, because you're literally kind of setting the tempo as you dance and you move on the bike.
Yeah, and I think there is a call to creativity here. Like it's easy to deride the fact that basically the founders of SoulCycle were very comfortable with capitalism, and it isn't too much of an overstatement to say that they basically founded the boutique fitness industry, or at least they were some of the pioneers of the boutique fitness industry, and they're very comfortable with that and claim it. But there is, I think, an invitation when it comes to this landscape of changing religion and changing community to really ask, like, what are the innovations that we have to bring forward in this landscape that are going to serve and reach a lot of people, and not necessarily follow this particular model or have a kind of pay-to-play design to them, but that have other designs, and what would those be?
So all of these case studies are part of a much larger field of communities that we've gotten to know, including places like Thread in Baltimore, or the November Project, which is national now as well, the Harry Potter Alliance, which mobilizes people into social justice action using the narratives and characters of Harry Potter. Close to my heart, of course. And one of the things that we kept seeing over and over again that sat underneath these very disparate communities in terms of what they did was the kind of things that they were fulfilling in people's lives. And so in How We Gather, we talked about these 6 themes. The sense of social transformation, wanting to, whether it was around social justice or whether it was around beauty, in some way change the world around you. Personal transformation. Wanting, whether it's a physical, I want to look hot, so I'm going to go to CrossFit. I want to, maybe it's about a skill that you want to build, like at Artisans Asylum. There was something, a kind of a self-improvement or a personal transformation element. And this theme of accountability, which, for good reason, I think so many faith leaders have been wary of because of the history of marginalization and exclusion of people with marginalized identities. There's a real hesitancy to kind of go all in on accountability. But we found that once there's safety, once people feel like, okay, like I'm okay, I'm fundamentally worthy and good, then it's a beautiful thing to be held accountable to the things I've said that I want to do.
Another being creativity, and basically creating space for imagination and play, and for this sense of expression of what is mine to give. That's been a huge theme we've noticed, and that connects a lot to that next one of purpose finding. Just this, one of our metrics has become, of the depth of these communities, has become people leaving their jobs, because something that will happen by their participation in some of these communities is that they discover a clearer sense of their own purpose, and how in some cases it doesn't align with the way they're spending their everyday lives at the moment. So that sense of getting a deeper understanding and then taking action. And then the umbrella here is community, and we've become protective of the word community, I think. And sometimes we reference how during the environmental movement there was greenwashing, where everything was being called green when it wasn't necessarily doing much for the environment. And similarly, we're so hungry for community right now, I think, that you see a lot of language about community that is essentially not offering what community really feels like. And so there's something we wanted to lift up about these communities, that you are really seen and really loved through the ups and downs of your life, and you have the opportunity to really see and really love other people through the ups and downs of theirs, and that there's something different in these communities than, for instance, what you get out of a network, or these more shallow expressions of being together.
Right. So when we started to look in this kind of research project, we were only looking at secular communities. But of course, once we started to do that, we kept hearing about all sorts of religious communities or communities that claimed a tradition, even if the form of what they were doing was very different. So, for example, Nadia Bolz-Weber is famous for her amazing Lutheran community in Denver. And what's interesting there is that actually she went all in on the liturgy. She kind of really took something very, very old and held that, but then kind of put it into a modern context. So, she's tattooed and swearing and very honest about her struggles with substance abuse and relational difficulties. So there's an openness and a vulnerability to her ministry, even though she's taken something very, very old and kind of transformed that. Or things like I was just at Labshul for the High Holy Days, and there Amichai Lau-Lavi, who's the rabbi there, has kind of taken the textual tradition of Judaism, but has introduced or has reintroduced really the important oral tradition of talking back to the text. So how do you take something, again, that's very old and do it in a new way? So it's not a synagogue with a building. They say they're God-optional, pop-up, and artist-driven. So what we found was that they're kind of this really juicy space between what might look secular and what might look sacred, even in the community, started to be a little bit more tricky to talk about. And that became very real for us as we started to gather the leaders of these communities. So you'll recognize this picture is just outside of this building. We, in 2015, hosted the first group of leaders in November of that year. Again, just as students, people crowdfunded each other's journeys. We had people coming from Sunday Assembly in the UK and from all across the US. At that point, they were just secular. The next year, we brought together leaders who came from some of these religious communities as well as the secular communities. And within 4 hours, you couldn't tell who was who. The sense of shared work that sat underneath these leaders was so clear. And frankly, the responsibilities that they felt was so shared. Again, people texting their soul cycle instructors at 4 p.m. on a Sunday saying, should I divorce my husband? People have not been trained for that. So they were hungry to find okay, religion can give me answers. Pastoral theology can help me with this. Thank goodness, I need some support. So we found that bringing these leaders together, introducing them to one another, and then connecting them to resources within, and not just money, really, I mean pastoral care skills, theological reflection skills, these were resources that these leaders needed.
The idea of being in a relationship with elders, that became a huge part of our work, that these leaders not only were lonely in their leadership in terms of having peers, which is something we try to help with, but also having inspirations, right? Having elders in their lives that had in some way walked this path before. And just a note to say, we're not going to profile the innovative religious communities here, but the second report we wrote was called Something More, and that has a bunch of those profiles in it. So those are communities that have a religious identity but look a lot more like these secular communities than they do like their own traditions' mainstream presence. So in the room, this started to emerge, and I'll just read it. It says, the secular sacred divide was non-existent. There was a group of people asking what wants to emerge and how we can best see and support the light in one another as we seek to build communities that make us less alone and more human. And I think while that's just one participant testimony, it encapsulates beautifully what we noticed as well in terms of the kinship, first of all, amongst these leaders, and in some cases a kinship that went beyond maybe what they felt in their own traditions. We had one Methodist minister saying, I go to the Methodist conference of bishops and whatnot, and I feel like a total outsider, but here I feel with sitting beside someone who leads a running group and a Muslim community, I feel like I'm with my people, right? So that kind of experience. And then really the twin, less alone and more human. And we've started to use language of belonging and becoming for that, but basically if you think of the circle of a community and feeling that unconditional sense of love and belonging, and then more the spiral or the arrow, the directionality of who am I becoming in the midst of that, and how am I contributing to a collective becoming.
And so we've started to explore how can we look at what's happening, not within the traditional kind of categories of well, this is Jewish and this is secular and this is Buddhist, but how can we look at what are the jobs that they are doing? So in the last report that we wrote, Care of Souls, we tried to point to kind of 7 different roles that we saw across these communities: the gatherer, the healer, the steward, the elder, because what we've thought about as religion kind of traveling through these pneumatic tubes is just so not representative of people's lived experience, whether you're brought up in an interfaith household, whether you kind of grew up with nothing but end up discovering, meditation practice, singing, and running, that those are the places where you really connect at a spiritual level, whether you go on retreat twice a year, you read this type of book, but you're married to X. People's own lives are bricolaged together from these different spiritual places and lineages, and it's easy to dismiss that as saying, well, that's shallow cafeteria religion, there's no integrity there, but people are doing the best with what they can, and I think our standpoint has always been, well, how can we help them, how can we firm that and then help them go deeper with it. So when it was that example of, a Muslim, a Methodist, and a Mormon sitting literally in this room together being like, oh my God, we have something in our lives that we're doing that is the same. It wasn't to make invisible the real differences between their traditions and their practices, but there was something that they were doing in their own lives and in the lives of their communities that felt something along the line of this belonging, becoming intersection. And it's important to say, I think, that religion fulfills different jobs at different times. I mean, in the Jewish community, a big conversation right now is, younger people don't seem to be attracted to the Jewish institutions, whether it's a federation or a JCC or a synagogue. And it's in part because those institutions were set up in a world where, Jews couldn't go into the local swimming pool, or they didn't feel welcome in a local community center, the country club, for example, structural barriers. But now, as a 21-year-old Jewish person, that's not a lived reality in the same way. So that the institutions have to find a different function that they're fulfilling in the lives of these young people. So our bet is really at this intersection of belonging and becoming. So to conclude, these are some of the things that we've really taken away, which we hope will be useful to you for those of you who are community leaders in your own right or working with this population, as it were. The leaders that we've gathered and profiled and gotten to know really are doing shared work. That the kind of the language of secular or sacred or Mormon or Methodist or Muslim, there's something that is shared in the work they want to do.
And they've started to see themselves, I think, as an ecosystem of some kind. And so with that, they want to be less alone and spiritually supported in that work. There's a recognition and sincerity that I have found very moving from a lot of these leaders who, again, maybe didn't realize what they were stepping into, right? That by leading a makerspace or a spin class, they were going to end up providing in some way for the whole lives of people in their care. But in many cases, there's a sincere desire to actually deepen their own well so they can go deeper with people. And so in order to do that, they really crave kinship, the sense of having peers, as well as I mentioned, elders. And that's not just about the intergenerational dimension, although that's huge, but it's also about a sense of there being wisdom that has been gleaned from experience that they themselves can learn from, right? And so with that piece especially, there's a real invitation to existing institutions and carriers of that ancient wisdom across generations and centuries to this moment. There's so much that is bundled into the religious institutions we've inherited that is so needed right now as this landscape emerges and as these leaders attempt to forge a path into what is really uncharted territory. So there's a real invitation for institutions to be in relationship with what's emerging and to discern what those gifts are for this moment. And then, as Casper said, just this speculation that we have, that the future of spiritual community is going to be religiously diverse, and so that the organizing principle is no longer the creed necessarily, the shared belief of the people involved, but rather some sense of shared orientation or goal or directionality toward becoming.
So with that, we will close. I know it's on the hour, so if anyone needs to go, thank you so much for being here. You are welcome to slip out. But we also want to open up for some questions, probably for about 15, 20 minutes or so. So thank you very much, and we'll be glad to hear some.